We are live. I'm just going to give this a couple of seconds for attendees to come in before we start. Hello, friends. Welcome to Be Waste Wise. I am Shweta Vandapani. I am one of the community builders on Be Waste Wise. We work in the space of knowledge dissemination in waste management and sustainability. We have moderators all over the world who put together webinars and panels which talk about diverse topics related to waste at large. The topic for today's webinar is what new federal policy means for waste and recycling in the US. We have the team from Waste Dive to discuss this. They've reported extensively on this. So we have Cole Rosengren, Megan Quinn, and Jacob Wallace. All three of them have been moderators on Be Waste Wise. They've talked about various subjects on our platform. You can go to the webinar section on our website. You'll be able to find them there. And just a few housekeeping reminders to you. Use chat to introduce yourselves. We'll also share links to the stories that the speakers are referring to on chat. And please use Q&A for your questions. We have a large number of attendees, so I'm sure the panelists will lose the questions on chat. Over to you, Cole.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Be Wastewise for hosting, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Managing Editor Cole Rosengren with Waste Dive, and glad to be joined by Senior Reporter Megan and Reporter Jacob here. And as folks well know in the industry, it's been a very busy time at the federal level. New federal administrations always bring change for the sector, but this has felt especially active, let's say, and perhaps even more so than the first Trump term that we covered before. And so with that in mind, we thought it'd be useful 6 months in, roughly, for the new administration to check in on what's been going on and take your questions. We're very interested in hearing from you folks. As Sweta said, please use the Q&A function, and we'll be keeping an eye on that, and we're glad to take questions throughout the discussion here. So just to set the stage, as folks probably know by now, but it has been a major period of change for the US EPA, many hundreds of layoffs and various staffing cuts, big shift in policy from the Biden administration, and this is starting to have ripple effects in terms of policy for waste and recycling. Also, a lot of movement at the congressional level. We'll talk a bit more later in the program about the big tax bill that President Trump signed, what implications that has for the industry, and then other things we're still watching that could play out in this current Congress. So to start out, we want to just give folks an overview of sort of what has happened in case you haven't been following, and especially for some of our international audience. So Jacob, can you tell us a little bit, please, about the EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin, his relevant waste background, and what his priorities have been so far this year?
Yeah, definitely. So Lee Zeldin was a former U.S. representative from the state of New York. He was in Congress from about 2013 to 2023. So he's there for a decade. He was a Republican. And for the most part, he tended to vote against legislation that would have enhanced environmental regulations. There's one notable exception, is that he would sometimes vote in favor of regulations to address PFAS. It's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, forever chemicals. Megan will talk more about those things specifically, but obviously PFAS has become a growing issue for the waste industry. So, during his nomination process, there was some question about how he would approach those kinds of topics, given sort of moderation there. But we've seen that that's not necessarily the case. And to give you a sense of how his, strategy or politics have changed, in 2019, he cast a vote to protect mercury and air toxic standards from this planned Trump rollback. But this year, under his direction, the EPA is actually proposing to roll back that exact same rule. And they just had a hearing about that rollback last week. And that's a rule that specifically affects like oil and coal-powered power plants. But, incinerators, for instance, have very similar regulations. So you can expect that, there might be a similar approach there to maybe rolling back some of the air pollution standards that we have. But yeah, in short, we shouldn't consider this the same Lee Zeldin that we might have seen in the U.S. House. But yeah, earlier this year, the EPA had a big day where they announced 31 regulatory rollbacks. And we and frankly the agency are still, I think, sifting through the list of many priorities. But one of the highlights for the waste industry is they proposed weakening the greenhouse gas reporting program, which has tracked emissions from landfills and other industrial facilities for more than a decade now. So it's possible we'll see that program essentially wound down. Like I said, the agency is still sort of finalizing what it wants to do. But yeah, I mean, if we do see that program kind of go away or shrink, that essentially hampers, data tracking efforts for emissions from those landfills. And could see we could lose essentially that source of data. Uh, let's see what else. Yeah, and I mean, the EPA under Zeldin's direction, will also be handling a bunch of regulations that affect the waste and recycling industries. For me, I focus on landfills at Waste Dive, among some other priorities. So, they've got new source performance standards and emissions guidelines. Those are the two regulations that really affect municipal solid waste landfills. Those regulations, specifically for air pollution, are due for an update this year. And last year, the EPA said, it would update those standards in 2025. But when I asked the agency last month what their plan was for those regulations, they essentially gave me a non-answer. So, what happens, we'll see. But yeah, Cole mentioned, destaffing is something that's been happening in the agency under Zeldin's direction. I think since the start of the year, there have been more than 800 employees that have left the US EPA. And they've essentially said they wanted to roll back staffing levels to something like what it was 40 years ago under the administration of President Ronald Reagan. So that's obviously a significant change in how this agency can function. So, we're already seeing, again, the slowdown in, approaching, crafting new regulation, responding to certain enforcement priorities, which is also a change that Administrator Zeldin wants to see. And, with that decline in staffing and these shifting priorities, we can expect to see those things continue. But that's sort of the overview of how the agency has looked under Zeldin.
Thank you. Yeah, and as folks can tell, there's been a lot to keep up with so far this year. Interestingly, while staffing is being rolled back, we are seeing one key staff position, Senate-appointed position, likely be filled. Megan, can you please tell us a little bit about the assistant administrator role for the Office of Land Emergency Management and what we're seeing now under the administration?
Yeah, so that person who's the nominee right now is John Busterud. This is a office that we consider kind of the main waste office of the EPA. It covers a lot of the stuff that a lot of people in the waste and recycling industry care about in terms of regulations. And John Busterud, he's a pretty well-known person in the EPA. He worked for, I think it was Region 9. So he's been in the EPA for a while. Part of, and that was also during the first Trump administration. The other thing is that he has an environmental law background. However, he's really well known for being a pretty business-focused kind of person, which is something that you'll see a lot in the Trump administration. The Trump administration, just across the board, has really prioritized, business aspects, domestic supply chain, shoring up the U.S. Domestic markets to reduce reliance on other nations. So to see that, he's been on, John Busterud has been on a few boards that were kind of these economic but also environmental sort of combinations. You see the administration really trying to fill that role where that's a balance. And you see the EPA, which is a little different under the Trump administration than the Biden administration, really emphasizing the importance of, we really want to protect the environment as well as our, business and economic interests. And you see the Trump administration talking a lot about priorities to sort of make sure that both of those are served. So.
Got it. Yeah, it'll be interesting. We are waiting on final Senate confirmation for that nominee, but it's likely to go through. And that would be notable because for anyone following along at home, there never was a confirmed person in that role during the Biden administration. And so that's is big.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, the previous person who was the nominee for that role, Carlton Waterhouse, he was really well known for having a strong environmental justice background, which was a huge hallmark of the Biden administration. So that's another sort of big difference between the Biden administration EPA and the Trump administration EPA, because the EPA now has not only de-emphasized environmental justice, they've really, stricken that from their programs. So.
Mm-hmm. That's a good segue to the next thing I wanted to ask about was another big change and things folks have been trying to keep up with this year is federal grant funding, right? There were a lot of programs that were allocated hundreds of millions of dollars under laws signed during the Biden administration, most notably the infrastructure law, but also Inflation Reduction Act and others. Jacob, you have done a good bit of reporting on that this spring. Can you tell us just briefly, please, what does that look like? How have folks that were expecting this grant money been adapting to this change?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like Cole said, I mean, under the Biden administration, we saw, I believe, hundreds of millions of dollars in grant funding go out to, waste and recycling related projects. Is some of the most funding we've ever seen to the industry, frankly. And again, like he said, that was funded mostly by the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a big bill that had a lot of climate priorities in it. But since the Trump administration began, they've really worked to undo a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that includes a series of grant programs. And the administration has gone about it through, I'll say, arcane ways, a variety of different arcane ways to try and stop grant funding from going out the door. And they've been successful in some instances, but less so in others. But the net effect is that, we've seen projects around the country that deal with improving, recycling facilities, with improving composting facilities. Those grant recipients have essentially not been able to access the funds that they got under contract, through the previous administration. Sorry. And so, yeah, I mean, that's going to be a big change with this new administration is, that large amount of federal funding that has gone towards these programs will no longer be there. And some folks that have already thought that they had that funding locked in, they might not. And it's interesting too. I mean, some of these programs, the grant programs that seem to be most imperiled are the ones that directly address things like climate change or environmental justice. There are some programs where we might see funding continue. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, for instance, has this composting and food waste reduction agreement program. They're not always grants that go out. Sometimes it's, funding match or loans or things like that. But we have heard in some cases that recipients of that funding are able to continue drawing down funds. And again, it can literally be that they don't mention environmental justice in their contract or in their initial application, and that's why the USDA is willing to continue funding them, and they've been explicit about that. In the first Trump administration, we did see some interest in funding, waste and recycling related projects. So it's not like, the tap is going to be shut off completely, but it will look different. And frankly, there will be less funding available, at least based on what we've seen so far from the tax bill and Trump's proposed budget. So that is something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's certainly a big change for local governments and nonprofits that had been expecting some of that money. One other quick thread, because we've discussed there's been a lot of change. There are a few things that theoretically may have stayed the same, kind of core focus areas for the EPA. Food waste is one that was something that was discussed under the first Trump term, I think probably in different ways, but they see that as something that could continue. Megan, we also have a question in the chat about battery recycling, and correct me if I'm wrong, that work has also carried over from the last administration.
Yeah, thanks for that question, because battery recycling is an area where we're seeing a lot of investment and innovation. The Trump administration seems to really be getting behind battery recycling and a lot of other critical minerals recycling, again, for that same reason that I was mentioning before, of that it feeds into this whole like domestic supply chain theme, especially because a lot of the materials in batteries and other e-scrap are critical minerals that certain countries that the US is not the greatest friends with. That's a big source for. And yeah, you've seen a lot of different recent projects. Texas is a big area where we're seeing a lot of projects. And just around the country, you're seeing a lot of more well-known companies expanding their reach. Lithium battery recycling is a big sort of subsection of that. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that sort of innovation themed aspect of battery recycling in the next few years for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we see buy-in from waste industry trade groups on that, right? Because they're concerned about batteries causing fires in trucks and facilities. On the flip side, right, we have seen some battery recycling projects be affected by Department of Energy funding getting pulled back. There has been at least one or two notable examples of facilities that have stalled out or paused because that federal funding fell through. So it's a bit of a toss-up, but it is something we're following both on Waste Dive and our partner publication, Manufacturing Dive. So keep an eye on that. One other question just came in about grant funding, so we'll stick with that. It was asking any insight on the EPA Swiffer grant recipients for 2024. We, Megan, I'm going to go back to you because you had this story in April. We did ask EPA for an update, and they said that Swiffer, and or folks not aware of this, is the Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling grants. Told us it wasn't over necessarily. Swiffer's from the infrastructure law, but maybe that funding can carry on. Can you share any more on that, Megan?
Yeah, so they did directly tell me that they're still planning on doing another round of Swiffer grants. The amount that they think might be dispersed this time around would be about 58 million for the community, states, and territories piece, and then another 20 million of Swiffer grants for tribes. They didn't give me a good timeline other than it could be the summer or fall. So it could be tomorrow, it could be sometime at the end of the fall, but they did confirm that that is something that they're still planning to do. And then there's also some of this recycling education funding that they also confirmed is still in the works. Those two types of grants get squished together sometimes because they cover different things, but they're still relevant to the recycling industry. So the EPA said that they still had about 39 million in recycling education grant funding. This time around, they're only going to give that to one applicant, which could be a group of applicants all working together. But that's a little bit of a difference from the first time around. But yeah, so there's still money available according to them.
Yeah, one short thing I'll add is just in the budget proposal that President Trump sent to Congress, he did include $5 million to continue administrating that Swiffer program. That's not money that's going out to recipients. It's just something to, make sure that the program office could continue, presumably. So, it's possible that, we will see that continue to go into effect. But yeah, unclear.
No, it's a good call out. And too, right, nothing's over till it's over. We will wait and see if the money actually goes out the door. But it's a good question. It's a good reminder for us as a team to check on that this summer and see where that stands. Switching to another topic that is a big one at the EPA and also for our audience, PFAS. You touched on it a little bit earlier, Jacob. This is an area where Lee Zeldin has some background, but there's been a lot going on here to keep up with. Megan, I'm going to turn to you because you have done some of our most recent reporting on this and also asked Administrator Zeldin about this at a press conference this spring. Can you give us a quick update on what has changed so far under the administration for PFAS as it relates to waste?
Oh my gosh, so much. Okay. There's a lot happening with PFAS. The administration has said that it's still a big priority to them. And in the waste and recycling industry, this is obviously a big concern because of, landfill leachate and biosolids and things like that. One big thing that happened back in May was that drinking water standards for PFAS, which had been enacted last year, partially got rolled back. So what that means was the drinking water standards and the minimum contaminant levels for the PFAS that were named in that standard. The EPA under the Trump administration took another look at that and said, let's keep the two main PFAS, PFOA and PFAS. And then these other four that were also named in the standard, we're going to take those out. We're going to kind of go back to the drawing board and do some more research on whether those should be in a standard or be managed in some other way. And that was a pretty big deal. I think, it didn't come as a surprise that that was going to happen. However, it kind of creates a little bit of uncertainty in terms of how the waste industry is, going to be managing their operations, just because, everybody's got landfill leachate to manage. They have relationships with drinking water treatment plants, municipal drinking water plants. So it's a little bit confusing. But the EPA has said, hey, we really care about PFAS. We think it's bad in certain ways, but maybe we need more research in other ways. So you'll see the EPA talk a lot about PFAS in drinking water and that being a priority, though the way that they manage that and what exact chemicals we're talking about when we talk about PFAS in drinking water, that's kind of up in the air. So that's one piece. Another piece we have is last year, the EPA also designated those same two PFAS that I just mentioned, PFOS and PFOA, as hazardous substances. That's a really big deal for the waste industry in the US because the concern for a lot of folks in the waste industry is how that hazardous substance designation, again, impacts their operations. The concern is that under the regulation, which is called CERCLA, or like the Superfund, a lot of folks say, like, is this going to cause a lot of liability concerns for us? Are we going to have to pay a lot of money for materials that are coming into our facilities that we can't really manage? We don't know what has PFAS in it. We just know they're coming into our facilities. Are we going to end up taking a lot of legal liability, financial liability to manage these under CERCLA now because they're considered hazardous substances? So you're seeing a big coalition of waste-related organizations. You see they're like lobbying Congress. There's a whole legal situation happening. We're following some lawsuits related to that. Just because the waste industry is, they want to follow the rules, but they're also concerned about maybe there being an outsized cost component or liability component for materials that they say they're passive receivers of. So they passively receive them. They don't know exactly how much PFAS is in them. So we're following some court cases related to that. And, there's also some people in Congress who have mentioned that this is something they're tracking. Administrator Zeldin has specifically says that he's aware of the passive receiver camp and that he is talking with people pretty actively about it. So to hear that from the administrator of the EPA is pretty significant. So there's a lot that we're still tracking to see sort of how that's going to play out in the next few months and years.
Gotcha. Yeah, definitely notable to have his support. We know the chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee has also been supportive of the waste industry's position on this. So nothing has happened yet, but it would not be surprising if some type of legislation or some type of policy change came through. As Megan mentioned too, we're on that CERCLA issue. We're still tracking the outcome of a court case there. A group of business associations challenged the Biden EPA's CERCLA designation last year. That court case is still pending, and the new EPA has yet to weigh in on where they stand with that. We track the filings. Every few weeks, every month, they say, hey, we need more time. The legal term is they ask for an abeyance. And last I checked, as of like a week ago, they'd asked for another abeyance. So we have not seen an official stance from the Zeldin EPA on this yet. But stay tuned. So yeah, it's, creates an uncertain environment where folks, landfills and others are waiting to see where the drinking water standards finally settle out and figure out where they need to treat for this. Some already are investing in, PFAS treatment technologies, but it's in flux. There was also effluent limitation guidelines that were proposed for landfills that are on pause now, but may come back. It's a lot going on. One other piece to dig into, Jacob, that you've covered is the biosolids issue. Can you tell us a little bit about where that fits into all this?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting emerging area of, I guess, concern for, federal regulators. I think for the past 5 years now, the EPA has said we're going to take a close look at PFAS contamination in biosolids, which is essentially the sewage sludge is, the layperson's term for it, but, the stuff that comes out of wastewater treatment plants. So in the US, there have been a few states now that have started to propose and adopt legislation looking into this issue. In some cases, Maine specifically, they banned the disposal of biosolids in landfills because they're worried about, sorry, on agricultural land, because they're worried about contamination, and that created a problem for the landfills in the state because biosolids are aqueous substance, they're kind of wet, and fitting those into the landfill, you need something dry to balance it out, and that became a huge problem. But what's happening is, these states, they want EPA to weigh in and give them some real guidance on PFAS contamination biosolids. Is it dangerous? Do we need to stop putting biosolids on agricultural lands altogether? What needs to happen here? So there was a roadmap that the EPA was following under the Biden administration to take a look at this issue. And they're supposed to put out a risk assessment. They put out a preliminary version in January, right before the Trump administration came into office. And they said that essentially the land application of biosolids won't create PFAS contamination concerns for people who are eating food or something that comes from agricultural land that spread those biosolids. There's a chance that the farmers working that land might experience some negative effects, but that was kind of the EPA's initial findings. It's still very much a preliminary finding though. And so they're still supposed to put out, a more comprehensive assessment and possibly rules limiting the amount of PFAS that you can have in biosolids. But we don't know exactly where that stands now. So right now, Congress is also debating the budget for the federal government for the next fiscal year. And we did see there was some early language that might block the release, essentially, of this sewage sludge risk assessment. That language, again, is in a draft of the budget, so we don't know exactly where that's going to end up. It might, persist, and we'll see that carry through into the final budget language. But something that's still certainly on our radar, and we could see action one or the other from the federal government on this. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so stay tuned. As folks can tell, there's a lot of moving pieces here on PFAS and biosolids. Thank you to folks in the audience for your questions that are starting to come in. We really appreciate that. I think we'll do it. Let's tackle some of these here, in part focused on the ones related to things we've been talking about: environmental regulations, air emissions. So Megan and Jacob, I'm going to synthesize some of these and just start throwing them out. Please feel free to jump in as you would like. There's a couple questions about the Trump administration's stance on incineration for energy recovery. Do they support it? Where do they see it fitting in? Any updates on regulation there? Jacob, you're probably best suited for this.
Yeah, definitely. We haven't seen any major regulatory actions taken on incineration. I think, like I said, the overall trend or mood that we've seen from this administration is deregulation. They want to, unleash American energy. That was one of the first executive orders that President Trump signed. And so, on that note, I think there are some proposals to roll back certain air emission regulations that could end up essentially making operations easier, for waste to energy facilities. So I would say that is the overall mood we've seen. The weird thing about air emission regulations for incinerators is that, number one, there are different categories that the EPA divides up and sets different standards for. So there's, the municipal solid waste incinerators, there's hazardous waste incinerators, and a few others besides. And each of those, I think, has had a lawsuit work its way through the courts within the past year, basically. And so the EPA is under consent decrees for certain categories for needing to craft or update regulations for them. Most of those are still essentially actively being, written right now. And so, that gives the Trump administration and, Lee Zeldin's EPA an opportunity to put their stamp on the regulations, essentially. So what that final language will look like, we'll see. But that's, again, based on what we've seen from this administration. I don't anticipate them to take an aggressive approach to regulating, waste energy facilities or incinerators. So.
Yeah, and as folks know, it's hard to cite new ones. We are seeing some movement on that, especially in Florida, that we have heard anecdotally that the Trump family is not thrilled about a proposal near one of their resorts in the Doral area. So maybe that's just a local issue, but
I was gonna say they just had a meeting. Miami-Dade County is proposing to craft a new waste to energy facility, and they're likely moving ahead with a new facility, but probably not in Doral, whatever, where that Trump facility is. So and to Cole's point, we haven't seen a lot of new waste to energy facilities built in the U.S. in recent years, but there are still places like Florida that are looking to invest in that technology. So yeah, we'll see.
Let's see. We also had a question in here about the role of incineration in PFAS destruction. And I know, Megan, you've done some recent reporting. Jacob, feel free to jump in after, please. Can you tell us a bit, Megan, on where incineration fits into EPA's recommendation for PFAS destruction and some of the recent facility tests we've seen here?
Yeah, so incineration has been one of the options for trying to destroy PFAS, and you will see different companies who operate in the US come out with these announcements about how well that works for them. So you've seen like companies like Veolia comes to mind, who also operates throughout the EU. Having these third-party testers come out and just kind of figure out like, okay, we have this incineration process. Is it really getting rid of all the PFAS? And the standard that they typically say will be like 6 nines, which means like 99.9999% eliminated. And in the US, offering PFAS destruction techniques, incineration, but also some other types of uses, is a really big business proposition. Even though it's a little unstable right now to determine some of these regulations that I mentioned earlier, how those affect the landfill waste industry in general. I've talked to companies as recently as like last week saying, no, business is booming in the US for PFAS destruction techniques because some companies just don't want that liability, or they are beholden to state laws that are stronger than the federal laws. So the companies operating in the US who do this type of incineration work are trying to expand their business even more. So I don't know if that answers all of your question. I got excited talking about incineration, but
Oh, that's good. I think, yeah, and we've seen it is, and for folks who aren't aware, EPA under multiple administrations puts out destruction disposal guidance. These are not regulations, but they are recommendations and research about the available PFAS destruction disposal technologies. There's been some talk of could and should those be released more frequently. The last round was last year that we saw those come out. We have seen there's some, ongoing research questions about air emissions from PFAS incineration. That is something the prior EPA called out as something they would like to see more work on. But, as Megan said, companies, Veolia, Clean Harbors, others see this as a business opportunity, as viable, and they have been meeting the new standards, and the EPA standard got more stringent, I think would be the right word, for testing this last year. So more to come. I would expect that's probably a growing business area for sure.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is the EPA under Trump has said that they want to publish guidance more often and publish more science on these destruction and disposal techniques. So that's something that they've flat out said. So we'll see when we might next get some more information. I think that the conversation has really shifted a lot towards doing more research on all of these this suite of technologies. So yeah, definitely more to come.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
and just put an even finer point on it. Like we've talked to companies about, their approach to this technology, given that, we might not see the Trump administration dramatically increase, PFAS regulations for certain, potential sources. And the companies that we've heard from, by and large, have said like, look, we're investing in this technology. It's a long-term play. Like, they fully expect to continue to see business for these incineration technologies and other ways of treating PFAS contaminated items as well. So yeah.
Another question's come in is interesting. I don't know if we're fully equipped to answer it, but we'll try. Any discussion about the inclusion of PFAS and stormwater sampling as part of the industrial multi-sector general permit beginning in 26? This would relate to discharges from and surface water impacts from landfills and other industrial sites. Anything come to mind for you folks? And if not, we can follow up with you, Jeff, later on this.
Yeah, I was going to say stormwater is an area that I haven't personally done a lot with, but it's coming up in the conversations quite a bit. So maybe that's an area for us to, people want to hear more about.
Yeah, I would say ditto. Something for us to take a look at. But yeah, no, it's certainly I think an emerging area of interest. So yeah.
Sure. Well, it's a good question, Jeff. We'll follow up with you on that one. I'm making a note. Another one. Oh, we have, okay, one more on PFAS. Are companies that manufacture PFAS investing in or parenting PFAS treatment companies? Interesting question. Yes, this is an area we've been exploring a little bit more on Manufacturing Dive. We've seen those such as 3M and others, they are investing in this to some degree. It seems like a lot of the PFAS treatment tech is coming out of third parties so far, or sometimes the waste companies, but it's worth looking at. In general, yes, we're seeing a lot of interest there from manufacturers in putting in treatment technologies at their own sites to manage their industrial discharge and things along those lines, because they have to comply with the effluent guidelines. One other not on PFAS, but sticking on the broader deregulatory theme, there's a question in here about, is there any talk about RCRA or some of these other more long-term regulations trying to be changed or stripped? I will say I have not heard it yet. I don't know if you two have. One thing that I think, even if the regs are on the books not being changed, is notable, though, is if staffing is so much lower and enforcement priorities have changed, that could have an effect on these policies.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would go back to the budget again. I'm trying to pull up the numbers now, but in Trump's budget, he did propose like a significant decrease in the budget specifically for the RCRA office and, lower staffing as a result. Again, this is like an early proposal. We did see these sorts of, dramatic changes in, office funding in previous Trump budgets in his first term. And then sometimes those would essentially go back to normal by the time, the budget worked its way through Congress. So who knows what'll happen there. But yeah, I mean, certainly to your point, Cole, like, the destaffing, the lower budgets, would imply that they have to cut back on some of what they would call their lower priorities and, focus on like the high ticket items. You also just mentioned enforcement priorities, and I can talk very briefly about that as well. The EPA has like it's called now I'm blanking on the name, it's NECIs, but basically they have a list of priorities that they put out once every few years for what they want to focus their enforcement efforts on. They have a limited budget. So like, here's the things that are important to us, basically. The Biden administration and its enforcement priorities included things like climate change and PFAS. And the climate change one specifically ended up seeing the EPA take a really close look at landfill gas emissions, and they were going around and finding what they called widespread noncompliance with, air pollution rules among landfills around the country. And that was something they found because of those enforcement priorities. And when the EPA had its day where they announced, 31 regulatory agenda items, part of that was changing the enforcement priorities. And that means taking away the PFAS focus, taking away the climate change focus. And so that does have, downstream effects on, what these waste offices within EPA will focus on.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good call, and that's continuing to show up as we're seeing in different enforcement here. We had a couple more areas that we wanted to make sure to highlight that we've seen a lot of activity in, and we'll keep hitting these questions along the way. On the topic of landfill emissions, an area that we have seen increased investment and interest from our readers in recent years is converting landfill methane into renewable natural gas for pipeline quality gas. Jacob, you've done quite a bit of reporting on this, both landfills and I should say anaerobic digesters that are managing organic waste. Can you tell us a little bit about what that has looked like this year under the new administration, especially with the new tax bill that has been signed?
Yeah, so that's like the big ticket item. We haven't even, it's been 40 minutes before we got to the reconciliation bill. But yeah, I mean, so that just passed, and that's a major piece of legislation. A lot of the things that, make headlines beyond waste was, about extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, those provisions that are considered like pro-business, basically. Um, but the reconciliation bill, which focuses on budgetary items and tax credits and things like that. It by and large got rid of a lot of clean energy tax credits that were created by the Inflation Reduction Act a few years ago. But there was one tax credit, the Clean Fuel Production Credit. I think it's 45Z in the tax code, if that means anything to you. But that is one that actually got extended. Essentially it's become part of the priority of the Trump administration to support policies like the Clean Fuel Production Credit that promote the production of biofuels. And so that's something that essentially good news for landfill operators or anaerobic digester operators because it's a tax credit that they can take advantage of, if they're using the biogas that their facilities produce to create a fuel. Usually that would be renewable natural gas or RNG. So I mean, that's very much something that has uh, been a boon to, the waste industry. And again, in the Unleashing American Energy executive order that President Trump signed, on January 20th, his first day in office, biofuels were among the kinds of American energy that they said that they wanted to promote this administration. So certainly can expect to see more. The other thing to keep in mind is the renewable fuel standard. That's a policy that the EPA has run for decades now. It is essentially an incentive program for alternative fuels. So that was initially meant like ethanol, but it's since expanded to include things like RNG. And so the EPA, the way it's like implemented the program in recent years has kind of changed. The way they do it now is they'll set basically targets for the amount of a certain kind of renewable fuel that they want to see in a given year. And then the alternative fuel producers go and meet it. And then producers of fuels that are, petroleum based have to go and buy credits from those alternative fuel producers. So that's an opportunity to make alternative fuels more economical. The Trump administration, or I guess, the Zeldin EPA, released its draft version of the renewable fuel standard about a month ago. It was the biofuels industry described it as like I would say a slight disappointment. It wasn't as ambitious as they were hoping it would be. Because the higher the target the EPA sets for the alternative fuels produced, the more those petroleum fuel producers have to buy, basically. So it becomes a stronger incentive for those alternative fuels. The target set was a little bit lower than what the biofuels industry wanted, and so that's why they're a little disappointed. But we'll see. It was a draft version of the regulation. The EPA really needs to get it finalized by the end of the year, but probably should get it done sooner because of the timeline for that program. So it's something that I'm keeping an eye on. But yeah, like I said, the draft just went out. The comment period, I'm not sure if it's closed yet, but it might have or is about to. And then they have to go back and review those comments. So yeah, stay tuned on that one.
Gotcha. Yes, lots to follow there. And as we've seen, a lot of investment, a lot of interest still in that space going forward. Switching to a different topic, Megan, that is up your alley, and we do have some audience questions on this too, is recycling. What, if anything, have we seen change under, the Trump administration on recycling? And also what is getting talked about recycling on the Hill lately?
Yes. So yesterday there was a hearing about talking about recycling as a business proposition, which if you're in the recycling industry, it's a business. However, I think a change in the tone of how this administration talks about the recycling industry is more, again, what we were saying earlier about, the domestic supply chain, things like that, and really how can we sort of like boost that our recycling supply chains for this greater economic sort of stability. So part of that, this hearing yesterday was about chemical recycling, also known as advanced recycling, or there's a lot of different terms for it. A whole suite of, technologies that essentially take plastics down to their building blocks to create new products, often other plastics, but it's a process that's also used for fuel. Which is part of why in the United States it's a pretty controversial topic. But you're seeing a lot of legislators asking about like, oh, is this a technology that we can really sort of leverage for better, economic value? Can we boost some of this chemical recycling technology? Can we invest in it? Can we change regulations? Because you're seeing the plastics industry in the US really advocate for these types of technologies to be reclassified as a manufacturing process, because currently most places they are a waste management process. So the industry says that that's just going to make it easier for them to be able to get permitting. It makes it more standardized across the board. It's more in line with what they say the spirit of what their technologies do. But a lot of environmental groups and there's other legislators, specifically a lot of Democrats, who are really wary of this technology in terms of its impact on the environment. So that's something that we're seeing a lot of conversations around. Chemical recycling is not a new process, but it is, I think, pretty notable to see Congress take note of it. So yeah, I think the EPA has said that they still consider recycling to be like an important part of their priorities. However, I think there's a pretty big change in terms of like how they talk about it in the Trump administration. Again, it's more of a, how can we use this as a business booster? And there was, I don't remember which congressperson it was, who was really advocating for this like balanced approach or like common sense approach. His view is that a lot of times recycling is sort of like this, it's just good, it's kind of a hippy-dippy, good for the environment thing. And yes, it can be good for the environment, but it's also a manufacturing process that we can harness. So that's one aspect of it. I think also, I don't know if you want to talk about other federal legislation, how that sort of ties into this, but I keep talking about this hearing because it was just yesterday, and it was pretty notable to talk about all this stuff on the Hill. But we're seeing a lot of these same groups, like the plastics manufacturing groups, and also people in the recycling industry, like the Recycling Partnership, advocating for more federal input, because legislation moves slowly. The federal government, regardless of which administration it's been over the last like 10 years, it's pretty slow to get any kind of recycling legislation passed at all, including a pair of bills that it has bipartisan support that would add a lot of resources for recycling infrastructure in rural areas. Because a big problem in the US is that access to recycling is very dependent on where you live. And there's a lot of people who say like, hey, if we can just bolster our infrastructure, especially in these rural areas, we would fix a lot of the things in our existing infrastructure and also give us a chance to also make these innovations that we want. But that legislation hasn't moved at all. And we'll see if it moves again. So that's one thing. There's a couple other things in the works, but yeah, we're probably not going to see a lot of federal movement on legislation, but you're seeing that certain pockets of the federal government is still talking about recycling in that way. So.
No, that's all helpful. And as you say, right, it's unlikely some of this stuff moves. It's possible it could get tucked into a budget bill. The pair of bills that Megan referenced almost did get included in a stopgap budget bill back in December, and then there was pressure from Elon Musk over the size of the bill, and so many add-ons like that got cut. But you never know; maybe it could get put back in. A few other questions have come in related to recycling and plastic. One, I can take, Megan, and please feel free to add here. Any thoughts about the US's posture at the upcoming plastics treaty negotiations? This is an issue we follow on our other publication, Packaging Dive, pretty closely. We had already been hearing the US was unlikely to be very active in those negotiations, probably not expected to be supportive. I just heard anecdotally the latest round of State Department layoffs last week included folks that hypothetically could have gone to those negotiations. I haven't 100% confirmed this, but it has been confirmed that some of those layoffs affected their climate staff. So I would think the US's role is even less in that situation now. Doesn't mean the plastics treaty may not go forward and won't be notable. And some companies could opt, into it, but we don't anticipate the US to be a big participant there. Megan, another interesting question about could we see any pressure from the federal level about state extended producer responsibility for packaging laws, discouraging them, for example? I haven't heard anything, but I don't know if you have.
Yeah, that's a great question because in the United States, extended producer responsibility, all the activity we've seen has been at the state level. So we have a handful of states that have very recently adopted EPR for packaging laws. These are obviously a lot more common in other countries, but this is still pretty new for the US. And the last couple of years, we always hear these different rumblings about, oh, maybe a federal EPR bill could get introduced. I haven't heard as much about actively of the federal sources sort of like actively working against that. I have heard scuttlebutt of, like Congress members at the federal level potentially being in support of a federal EPR law. The reason for that is typically, again, we haven't seen this as a bill at the federal level, but often when I hear people talk about it, the reason for having that federal bill would be just to sort of harmonize these very patchwork sort of EPR for packaging laws in the different states, because each state has crafted their EPR law pretty differently. There's some similarities, but the US is a big country. To get a lot of these bills passed, the stakeholders in different states have sometimes regionally different things that they want in that bill. You might see a state like, Colorado is like completely overhauling their entire recycling system throughout the state in their EPR bill, which you don't really see in some other states because Colorado has, some unique rural and urban sort of things like that. You see, in Oregon, there's a lot of emphasis on worker rights, fair wages, things like that. That's pretty unique to that region. But at the federal level, like who knows what that might look like. So every year someone's like, oh, we're gonna see a federal EPR bill, but I haven't seen one yet. And even just yesterday, I was hearing someone talk about that. So if that comes up, I'm very interested to see what that might look like and how that might impact or influence more state action. So.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one to follow, and we know some, as Megan said, some folks do want a federal EPR bill. I think it probably does make it easier in red states, the current climate, especially with the big focus on costs. And we've seen, for example, in California, they went back to the drawing board on some of their EPR regulations this year, with the governor citing cost as a concern. This is the same governor who proudly signed this bill a few years ago, but some folks wonder if his presidential aspirations are playing a role. And so I think it does influence, at least indirectly, some of those state EPR discussions. We have another question, Megan, on chemical recycling, and I know we're toward our time, but if you could give us quick thoughts on EPA recently denying reclassification of chemical recycling, which you covered in recent weeks.
Yes. So I'm not sure if this question is specifically asking about some of these air quality rules that just kind of declined to really focus on chemical recycling. It's a little complex because in this particular rule, depending on what iteration you first started following this rule on, there was a carve out where pyrolysis specifically was kind of taken out of these air emission standards with the intent that they might maybe have their own type of air quality standards or some other sort of treatment, kind of in line with what I was mentioning earlier about some industries want it to be all chemical recycling or most chemical recycling to be reclassified as manufacturing instead of waste management. So the idea was like, well, if we can take out pyrolysis and maybe like it's its own thing, these air quality standards can stay. And the EPA ultimately was like, we're not going to touch that in this specific air quality rule. And the final rule was published. And I think one of the little surprises was kind of like, oh, well, the Trump administration seemed like they were pretty keen to maybe go along with that. So it's yet to be seen how the federal government is going to think about chemical recycling in terms of air quality standards and in terms of other types of, not just emission standards, but other environmental standards in the future. And yeah, this was kind of a weird little case because this air quality standard was for incinerators. And like, depending on who you talk to, like people in the chemical recycling industry are like, it's not, what we do is not incineration. Pyrolysis uses high heat. It's not an incineration process, which is part of why they didn't want it in the standard. So you see all these little complexities where it kind of came to a head in this one specific standard, just because it kind of showed some possibilities of like where we might see a future federal regulation, but also a lot of that sort of like weird in between space, and which is why a lot of these chemical recycling companies are like asking for clarity. And even like environmental groups are also asking for that clarity because they're like, look, we really want there to be more stringent regulations for all kinds of industry, including plastics. So yeah, yet to be seen.
Thank you. That's helpful. As folks can tell, it's a complicated one. In our final minutes, I'm going to quickly answer some of these questions in the chat. Megan and Jacob, please feel free to jump in. One question, any specific advanced recycling processes that Congress is more or less wary of? I think as Megan touched on, plastics to fuel is more of a concern, though some folks don't like any of them. Another question we had is DOGE, which is the Elon Musk created Department of Government Efficiency. Are they done affecting EPA? I wouldn't count on it based on what we're reading. So I think that may be continuing. We had another one, have activists in the US considered adjusting language to not mention climate justice, for example? I think yes, we have seen some reporting on this. People are taking environmental justice, climate, certain terms out. And we have seen, just even in our reporting on some stories, some folks are wary to even put their names on things for concern about being perceived as liking that kind of language. We have one question here, Jacob, which I think would be good for you to follow up on in writing, perhaps after the fact, about natural gas. And then one also, Jacob, that I think I will ask you to take quickly live about sustainable aviation fuel. Has it panned out? I think no so far, right?
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like the billion-dollar question, like can waste to SAF actually work? Sustainable aviation fuel. You're right. The facilities that we've seen so far, a lot of them have not been able to make this work. But folks keep trying. I mean, there is still an incentive for a tax credit for sustainable aviation fuel that actually survived the reconciliation bill. I got a haircut. I got shortened basically to, I think it expires end of 2027 now. Initially they wanted to have that expire even sooner and early in negotiations, but jury's still out, is the short answer. But yeah, like I said, there are certainly companies that are continuing to try. They just are probably within the next few years going to get less federal support than they might have gotten under the Biden administration. So,
Gotcha. Well, thank you everyone for the questions. Like Richella, we'll follow up with you a bit more in writing for that one. In our final moments, I just want to kick it back to both of you once more in 30 seconds or so. Anything else you're watching this year that should be on people's radars for the rest of 2025 as it relates to Trump and waste? And Megan, let's start with you, please.
Yeah, I would say one thing I'm interested in seeing how it plays out is the impact of tariffs on the recycling supply chain, because recycled commodities are commodities. And then there's been a lot of uncertainty just because of the changes that the US has gone through with each individual country. And so I think it'll be interesting to see sort of how that impacts just the overall supply chain for recycled materials, and what that's going to look like for operations. So that's one little thing I'm tracking.
Good call out. How about you, Jacob?
yeah, I mean, we mentioned a bunch of policies. One other thing I'll note is we're perennially asking about a farm bill, which is the 5-year budget authorization for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I was talking to someone today who deals with federal policy, or yesterday, I should say, but they were saying we might see a skinny farm bill this year, which means, maybe less priorities than, a full 5-year authorization. But that bill, when it was passed in 2018 under the Trump administration, created this food loss and waste reduction liaison position. And it was really a rare instance where the Trump administration kind of expanded its role in some of these waste-related issues, specifically organic waste, and kind of were willing to tackle that issue. So, if and when the next farm bill comes, that's going to be something where we should expect to see a lot of advocacy to continue to grow the federal government's role in organic waste, composting and anaerobic digestion. And, again, it might be something that this administration is willing to prioritize.
All right. Lots to follow this year, as we have heard. Thank you both very much for walking us through this today. We'll encourage anyone who's watching, if you don't already subscribe, please check us out at wastedive.com. We offer a free daily newsletter with all kinds of reporting about these issues. And also, please feel free to email us anytime. You can find content information for all of us on the editorial team page there. We'll always get back to you and always happy to hear thoughts or questions about this stuff. And thank you to Be Wastewise again for hosting. And Sweta, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Jacob. I think it was a lot to cover today. Thanks a lot for the time that you gave today, and thanks to the audience as well. We will consolidate a set of stories from Waste Dive and put it up on our website along with a recording of this webinar in 2 weeks' time. So do subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get an update about it. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Bye-bye.